So, welcome, everybody. I am with Pippa Chapman, who is an RHS trained, award winning garden designer, a forest gardener, and a permaculture educator. And she runs a permaculture gardening and food forest design business. She creates videos on a really successful YouTube channel, which we'll list below in the information here. Co-hosts the podcast Can I Dig It? And is the author of now two books published by us. One is Backyard Forest Gardening, and the other one, which is just about to be released in a matter of moments, is this fabulous book, Permaculture Planting Designs. And that's really what we want to talk about today. So, welcome, Pippa. And I should say, I'm Maddy Harland from Permaculture Magazine and Permanent Publications.
Oh, thanks, Maddie. It's
So,
great to be here.
yeah,
Excited to talk about my new book.
I know. So tell me, you trained with the RHS and spent some years as a gardener working in that sector before you discovered permaculture. What was the moment that made you, or what was this, what happened in with the observations you made that made you switch your whole approach and start life as a forest gardener?
Well, yeah, I suppose I've always been a very outdoors kind of child. I was always climbing trees and going for long walks, writing poems about wildflowers. It's always been something I've felt really passionate about for as long as I can remember. And I didn't initially want to go into horticulture. I initially wanted to be an art teacher, but when that didn't work out, I got a job in a garden centre, and I realised that I had this huge passion for gardening and being outdoors, which eventually led to me being head gardener on a large private estate. And I thought, wow, this is great. I'm in my 20s, I've made it. I've
Amazing.
got my own cottage on the estate. What, how lovely. But I think very quickly I realized that the kind of gardening that they wanted there was not how I wanted to garden. So they wanted bowling green lawns, not a weed in sight, no moss or lichen or anything on any bit of stonework. So I felt like most of my job was just destroying nature, really. That was there was lots of things I loved about the job. But I think over time that slowly became more and more of an issue for me. And I just remember one day when I was watering some weed and feed onto a lawn, just feeling really terrible about it. And a little bee flew under the weed killer, basically coming out of my watering can. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do this. So I decided actually to take a bit of an odd step and go from head garden to trainee. And so I saw some traineeship. So it's a 1 year apprenticeship at one of the Royal Horticultural Society gardens near me called Harlow Carr. And what I really loved about the traineeship was that Harlow Carr was really, at the time, leading the way in sustainable horticulture. So they'd built a brand new learning centre, which was all using ecological design and sort of low energy systems. They had plans for a large food forest, which unfortunately never got planted. But all these they were offering all these really interesting ways of gardening that just really fitted with what I wanted to do, how I wanted to garden. Um, and so it just felt like the right step. So I went to be a trainee for a year, one of the most amazing years of my life, just learning from people who were there, sort of working all day in a very practical sense, coming home and reading books and watching videos and sort of getting really nerdy about plants and sustainable growing. And yeah, and that while I was there, I used to go to the bookshop a lot, and so I found a book in the bookshop by Graham Bell called The Permaculture Way. And I
Yeah.
thought, oh, this sounds interesting. I'll have a read of this. And yeah, and that was it really. That's how I discovered permaculture. And then I joined our local transition towns group. and met some people there and eventually did my permaculture design course. So that was kind of, yeah, I think it was more that finding permaculture was, yeah, finding my people and realizing that that was a viable way to do gardening and to live.
Amazing, amazing to go from being a head gardener of an estate to a trainee and
Yes.
then do a permaculture design course. I mean, that's
Yeah.
quite, usually it sort of works in a different way. So that's amazing. Thank you. So one of your first gardens, which I loved because it was little, started with as a paved area, didn't it? Can you tell me a little bit about how you transformed that little home garden that was um, uh, uh, paved and turned it into a tiny food forest? Because I think that's so accessible. We think about food forests as forest scale and vast, and this was little. So tell us a little bit about that process and what you did first.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was quite a sort of fun and interesting journey, really. When I finished my traineeship, I happened to meet my now husband while I was there. And we started our own business and started planting up a part of my parents' small holding as a forest garden. And we started our own nursery and we started a family and the way you do all these things at once. Um,
Yeah.
and we started having tours where we would bring people round and take them up our hill and show them our forest garden. But particularly when the children were small, I found it really hard to I mean, I didn't have children who stayed where you wanted them to stay. They were just very adventurous and they were all over the place in different directions. And so I found it almost impossible to go up to our field forest garden and really do anything at all other than just walk around and point things out. So I started concentrating more on what I was doing in the yard. So initially, there was a bit of turf there and some beds that didn't really have anything in them. And so that became the real focus of my gardening time because I could easily pop out and they could, cycle around and cover the yard in chalk drawings while I actually got some gardening done. And it started off with sort of annual vegetables and salads, and then a few perennial salad crops crept in, and then a few, we put some espaliered fruit trees on the wall and a bay tree and then some currant bushes. And it sort of slowly evolved. It wasn't like I thought, I'm going to plant a food forest in my yard. It was just more that the more that I swapped the annuals for perennials, partly because it just meant less work for me to do with the kids when they were young and trying to run a business as well. It's just sort of slowly evolved. And then over time, people would come on our open days and they'd go up the hill and they'd say, wow, we just love this whole pattern of a forest and taking inspiration from that and using that as our way of growing food to meet our food needs. But, we don't have a field. How does this relate to us? And
Yeah.
so then we'd go
Yeah.
down to the yard to have tea and cake, and people would look around and say, oh, this is exactly what I could do in my own garden. And because it was our main bit of garden and I'd added in lots of colour and flowers and interest as well, it just seemed so much more exciting for people to think of that in their own garden. Because however much we might all know that we should leave nettles for butterflies and, that it's good to leave things messy, that's not what everybody wants for their main small
Yeah.
garden. So, yeah, so it was kind of very much an evolution of the garden that eventually I realized it was a food forest.
Right. So obviously that's very much influenced by being a mother as well as a garden, that sort of instant and easier approach. And are there any other aspects of or advice that you would have to people with young children about designing gardens that work with nature as well as with family life?
Yeah, I think just don't be too worried about mess for starters. If you plant things that grow easily, and that kids might enjoy eating as well. Like we grew a load of alpine strawberries, and it was never enough. However many we grew, it was never enough for the kids because they would just run out and eat them all. Um, but I think just this idea that you just have a much more relaxed style. I think annual vegetables are brilliant, and there's definitely a place for them. But as a parent, particularly with young children, and mine just never slept, so I was always sleep deprived and very disorganized and chaotic. The thought of sowing seed at the right time, remembering to prick it out, pot it on, water it, not let it get too leggy on the windowsill, put it out, keep the slugs off. It was just, even the thought of it was just totally exhausting. Whereas if you plant some alpine strawberries and some herbs and some perennial leeks and a few things like this, you could literally do absolutely nothing. And then one day in spring, just step outside and go, oh, look, kids, well, let's start eating. And it was just such a refreshing way of approaching the garden. And it meant that because things were a bit more robust, if one of the kids decided that today they're going to ride their bicycle right through the middle of the flower bed, it's not necessarily done such permanent damage because things might just spring back again. And so I think definitely there's that integrate, not segregate principle where there was particularly an area where the kids really liked because it was quite a long yard and
Yeah,
but they liked to cycle round in a loop. So part of the flower bed we just ended up making a little path and a willow archway with beans to grow up so they could just cycle through the arch and scoot through the arch without trampling on everything. So I think sometimes just accepting that you have to integrate their needs as well a little bit more into the garden than maybe you'd necessarily like.
absolutely. And that it's so difficult to garden with very young children who are active, which I had to.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
so you teach and write about observing the land before planting. Can you give me an example of where observation really changed your design in a way that you didn't expect?
I think quite often we think about a design just in terms of what it looks like and not so much the practicalities of it. So I think sometimes I thought, oh, it'd be really nice to have the herbs in this bit because that's where I want them to grow because that's outside the window and so that's that'll be convenient and it'll look nice when actually that's probably part of the shadier part of the garden. And even though it might seem like it's further away to plant them at the other end of the garden, sometimes you have to go with like where the sunlight gets to. And so I think sometimes, particularly when you move into somewhere new, and we've moved in when we moved into our garden, you sort of think, oh yeah, there's south. So I know instantly where all the sun's going to be, and you don't think about all of the, actually next door's house is in the way, or this tree is going to grow a bit bigger, and then there's going to be shade. And so I think that it's sort of spending time in your garden, you start to realize where things should go rather than just sitting down and going, oh, this is where I'd like them to go. When I look out of my window, I'd like to look upon a herb garden. Actually, if that's a shady spot, and however much you try, rosemary and sage just die every winter because it's too cold and damp and horrible, then those observations make it obvious, because things just don't grow well if you put them in the wrong place. But I think sometimes, and I know in permaculture design, you can think, oh, I'm going to make all my observations in one day, and then I'll know everything about my garden, and so then everything will be perfect, and that's why quite often we say spend a whole year observing.
Mm.
I think sometimes you can do something a bit in between. So you can do something that maybe is a mix of annuals and perennials for the first year, because of course none of us want to wait a year before we plant anything. So I think there's careful observations. As I say, I mean just things like the kids trashing the same bit of garden over and over again. You can't always preempt what observations you need to make. So sometimes it's just about getting started, not planting anything too permanent, and then making observations, as you go along.
And being prepared to move things.
Yes, definitely,
Yeah, I
yes.
mean, I've got a little no dig garden with fruit trees around the edge, and that is a place where I have started gardening fairly instantly with annuals, as you've said, and then I'm adding the perennials as I watch as the years pass. But for me, the woodland, so looking at sort of a much bigger space for permaculture design, the observational process is ongoing and will be a lifelong
Yes.
pursuit. So it depends, doesn't it, on the scale of
Mm,
what you're doing, as to how you respond
yes.
to land.
And here in our own garden, when we first got here, we weren't quite sure what we wanted to do. We'd put a polytunnel in. There was literally only one place it would fix. It's a very big polytunnel in quite a small garden.
Yeah,
So there was only one place it would go, and that's where it went. But then in the rest of the garden, we just used those pallet collars, and we made very pop
yeah,
up raised beds,
yeah,
filled them with what we had for a year. And then at the end of that year, we had a much better idea of what we wanted where. So we just, lifted up the edges and moved the
yeah.
pallet collars somewhere else. And that was a
Great
really easy
idea.
way of still getting something growing for the first year, but nothing too permanent.
Great idea. Great idea to do that. Yes. Um, so in the Plant Lovers Backyard Forest Garden, your first book, you write quite a lot about how people can even grow forest gardens in containers. And t tell me a little bit about the sort of design secrets of small spaces, what they teach us that in larger gardens we can sometimes miss. So give us some tips for tiny container garden, forest gardens.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes I get people saying, "Oh, I get so stuck with this idea of a forest garden because how do I get all these 7 layers in?
Yeah,
Like how do I
yeah,
fit every single layer into this small space?" And I say, "Well, actually, when we talk about forest gardening, and we're not necessarily saying every forest garden has to have 7 layers. We're saying, we're taking the inspiration from this natural ecosystem that is a forest, and we're taking what it teaches us and we're applying that to food growing. So in a way, it's just that the 7 layers are an easy way to break down this pattern
mm,
of a
mm,
forest so that we can use that information. But it doesn't mean every garden, every forest garden has to have those 7 layers in it. And actually, if you take a walk in a woodland or a forest and look around you, the likelihood is you won't see all 7 layers. In a natural forest, in most bits of forest, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tick all those boxes. And so why would we have to do that at home? So quite often I just say, well, why don't we think of it as it's a multi-layered way of growing, and we're trying to put in plants that will support each other, not compete with each other too much. So if all you can fit in, one large container or one small raised bed is a fruit tree, a fruit shrub, and some herbs, and maybe a few strawberries, then that's it. That would still, in my eyes, count as forest gardening because you're still looking at that multi-layered aspect and managing it in a way that is being kind to nature. So even if you just put a mulch of wood chip and some twigs on top of your pot rather than bare compost, immediately the soil in your pot is going to be much better. The soil life of things that are living in there are going to be much happier. And even just that small change will increase the biodiversity of your tiny mini, forest garden in a pot.
brilliant. So, in your new book, Permaculture Planting Designs, you've got 12 ready to use garden plans, which in a way feels a bit counterintuitive to the sort of basic ethos of permaculture, which is all about being place specific. And I wonder if you could tell, first of all, how do you overcome that by offering templates? That's my first question.
Yeah, so, well, I think when I was thinking about writing this book, and I kept thinking, well, that it goes against everything that permaculture says. Every garden, microclimate, and person is entirely unique, and you can't just do like a kind of paint by numbers, drag and drop version of permaculture and say, oh, everybody plant this and it will do well. And that doesn't work. But what I found was that people kept coming to me and saying, I just don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I haven't got a clue at all. They say I've visited some forest gardens, I've visited some permaculture gardens, but I just look around and I've no idea what any of the plants are. I just don't know where to start. So I had a few conversations with people and said, well, what do you think if I created like a set of different designs on different themes? As inspiration to say this is a plant list, this is some ideas of layout, this is kind of what a design looks like before it gets planted in a garden and then it's been growing on for 5 or 6 years. And so many people said that's exactly what we need, is not necessarily to say they're going to copy those exact designs, but just as a kind of starting point to at least start from. And I think I remember the thinking of it a bit like I really love sewing. That's my next big passion after gardening. But if somebody said to me, I want you to just make a pair of trousers, like we're not going to give you any other instruction, we're just going to give you some fabric and a sewing machine, and I want you to make a pair of trousers. And I would be so struck with fear that I wouldn't even start. Whereas you can buy a sewing pattern. And yes, that sewing pattern is not going to fit me exactly. It might be too small on the hips and too big on the waist and too short in the leg. But I can make those adjustments to fit my body exactly. But without that starting point, I would be entirely lost. So once I'd kind of got it in my head that that was more or less what I was creating for permaculture gardeners, then it all made a lot more sense. So
Right.
my idea was to create some designs as a kind of starting point to look at and think, oh, well, actually, I like the idea of planting these 3 or 4 plants together. Maybe I could start my design with that. And I'll take a few other plants off that list, but I'll put them in slightly different places because maybe my flower border is a different shape, or maybe I like some of the plants from the herbal tea garden, but I also like some from the skincare garden. So maybe I'll just sort of mash those together a bit and make it fit with what I want. So that was why I made this book that seems a bit counterintuitive to how permaculture design should happen. But equally, in the book, I do explain how to observe your own garden, work out your own microclimate and your own needs,
Yeah.
and do your own design. So I feel like it works well as a whole.
And I think I always say to people, grow what you like to eat. Or grow what you need. So I've got this big focus at the moment about garden tea. So herb
Oh, yes.
teas from the garden. Let's stop buying packaged teas.
Hmm.
And I do grow certain herbs and plants for tea, but I really want to focus that and get my harvesting and drying and I think it's about like working out what do I really want? Do
Hmm.
I want fresh salads? Do I want to also grow medicinals? Do I want to grow teas to drink? And of course, there's a crossover between the two. Do I
Yes.
want to grow a skincare garden? Do I want to mash it all up and have flowers too that are just pretty as
Hmm.
well as edible or good companions? So yeah, we choose, but you offer us some structure so that we're not overwhelmed and lost in
Yes. Yeah,
the
that was. I just wanted people to feel like there was a bit of a helping hand along the way, so you
yeah,
don't have to start with that blank page feeling.
yeah. So one of the things which I think is the rookie mistake is how people look at layering a garden and look at nature. Um, but don't quite succeed, particularly in climates that are cool temperate with much lower light.
Mm.
So how do you teach people to layer plants so that they cooperate and don't compete with each other?
Yeah, well, I purposefully in this book didn't make it all about forest gardens. It's very much about all sorts of different ways of planting. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make particularly in our climate, where there's lower light levels, we're not in the tropics, there's much lower light levels, and you just can't plant as many trees close together and expect to get a very productive understory. That's just how it is,
Mm,
even if you plant shade-loving plants, you're so much more restricted.
mm,
So I think the first thing I'd say is don't feel you even have to plant any trees. If there were some books in the designs in the book that you particularly liked, but you thought, oh, but actually I don't have room for trees, fine, miss the tree layer out. You I think it's trying to manage your light level. So if you're already struggling with a bit of a shady garden, you don't necessarily have to put any trees in there. If you're when you're designing, don't just think about the spread of each plant, think about the height of each plant as well, because something like Jerusalem artichokes, they can grow to 2 meters.
mm.
And so if you're not careful and you plant Jerusalem artichoke on one side and then it's entirely shading your Mediterranean herb bed, that's not going to work. So I think
Yeah.
just, have a bit of a think about how big certain plants are going to grow. And I think that it sounds very complicated at first, but once you split if you're making a plant list, you can just literally split your plant list into tall, medium, and short. And that means that as you're putting them together, just make sure you don't put anything really tall next to something short, sun loving that's on the wrong side, that's going to be shaded by that plant. Um, and I think to remember as well that even if you did that, even if you planted them in the wrong way, so long as you've observed that and made a note, it means that you can come back, at the right time of year when things are sort of becoming dormant and you can just swap them around, So then you've got the tall thing on the shady side and the shorter sun-loving thing on the right side. So just don't let that kind of fear paralysis that you might get it wrong stop you
Mm,
from doing things.
mm, mm,
But
mm,
sometimes it's hard to tell exactly where things are going to shade other things out until they're growing in your garden.
mm,
You
mm.
think that you've got it all right, but yeah, sometimes it's about just doing it and working it out later.
Yes, and not being intimidated by the dogma, I guess, of
Yes,
what
yeah.
ought to be permaculture or what ought to be a forest garden.
Yes, absolutely. And I think as well, in terms of like one of the things that I talk about quite a lot in general when I'm teaching or designing gardens is that this lovely way that we have of showing a picture of a forest garden with climbers growing up trees. But actually, in our climate, it's quite hard to get climbers growing successfully up trees. It's a real challenge, and quite often, if I'm growing somewhere and there isn't already a wall or a fence or some
Mm,
nice bit of trellis to grow a climber up, quite often I'll just miss them out
yeah,
because it's so hard to successfully grow climbers. If you try and grow, say, a nice vigorous kiwi up a dwarf apple, it's just not going to work.
yeah,
So I think whilst we might look at these nice, as I say, this nice way of breaking down the pattern of a forest, it's not necessarily
yeah,
translatable. I mean, I've done a few gardens where I've literally suspended ropes down from large trees,
yeah. I've
and
seen
that
that.
has allowed climbers to grow up that. But that's a massive mature tree that's
Yeah.
been there, 100 years already. Um,
I mean,
so,
that's my experience too, is that I've never succeeded growing climbers very well in
mm,
a what I would call a crowded space. They
yeah,
like the reason they climb is because they like light and they like
yes.
nutrients. And if you plant things next to trees, the tree's going to grab all the nutrients and not the
Absolutely, and all the
climber.
water.
and all the water. And it just, yeah, for me, it's something I've always left out
Mm,
of the layering of forest gardens this in this kind of cool, temperate, rainy climate with low
mm.
light. Yeah, it's never worked for me. So permaculture is taught as this set of principles. And you mentioned integrate rather than segregate in terms of integrating kids into the garden, which is a fantastic example of um, looking at those principles and actually using them. What other permaculture principles are there that you might use when designing a real garden? That
Um,
you've found particularly useful to hold in your mind as you're making decisions.
I think there's a few really. One of them is small and slow solutions. And I'm a big fan of small and slow because I know that I particularly get overwhelmed. You know, yes, I do gardening all day, but rarely in my own garden. And so I can't, you know, when we moved into our new house, we had this complete, well, I say blank canvas. We had to, you know, it was like chopping down a jungle before we could even start because the two hedges had kind of grown together on either side. It's quite daunting and it's quite a lot to think about, you know, to try and suddenly turn it into a garden. So actually, by breaking it down and saying, right, this year we're going to do this small bed. And maybe we might put some cardboard mulch on other parts of the garden. But for this year, we're just doing this one bit. So you can be really successfully creating this one small area. And then once that's all done, and you know that's working well, then you can move on to the next bit. And so then by the time you get to the end, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years down the line, you can have done your entire garden successfully. Whereas quite often when you try and come in and do everything all at once, 5 years down the line, half of it's overgrown because you took on too much and you couldn't keep up with the weeding and nothing quite got a chance to get established. And so I think small and slow solutions is a really good option. And in particular, you know, a lot of the more obscure perennial vegetables can be quite expensive. So to
Mm.
fill an entire garden with, you know, sort of more expensive things can be quite hard. Whereas if you do it more slowly, you've got time to grow things from seed, you've got time to beg friends and family for cuttings and all sorts. You know, it just, I think it works so much better than trying to tackle a big space all at once.
Yeah.
So small and slow is definitely one that I use a lot. When I do designs for clients, quite often I do it as a phased many year plan. You know, I don't just say, right, here's your design, make it happen. You know, we phase it over several years. Um, and I say that's what I've done here in my own garden. And another one that I like is this idea of from pattern to detail. So kind of breaking down a larger design into these smaller pieces. So quite often with a larger forest garden, I will break it down into individual guilds. So a guild is really where you're creating a little plant community around one tree. So rather than think, right, I've got this big space and I've got to plant, you know, 10, 20, 50 trees, and oh my goodness, what am I going to plant where? I can break it down into these little guilds. So it might be an apple tree paired with a gooseberry and some sweet cicely and some rhubarb and you know sort of this nice little guild that I've created. And then it might be if I've got a very large area, I might repeat that guild several times throughout a larger design. So if I've maybe made up 5 or 6 guilds and I've just repeated those over that space, that's immediately made my life so much easier than trying to individually pick each plant to go with each tree over, you know, several acres of land. And you can do that even in a small garden. So you might find that you want to plant 4 fruit trees. Um, but it feels a bit overwhelming. So you might just start to break that down into 4 guilds, you know, and then um, that makes it so much easier to sort of break up that wider, um, larger plan into smaller details. So that's something that I do quite a lot as well, which I think, you know, it fits kind of with the small and slow solutions as well.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I mean, you're all about not being overwhelmed by big pictures, big picture gardening, big picture permaculture design. And I think that's what makes your book so encouraging, that you do break it down into the detail. And but you're also suggesting different plants so that we can choose what we grow by our own personal taste.
Hmm.
So tell me, permaculture, often it's so beautiful in theory, but more challenging in practice. And we've been talking about this. Is there anything else that you've wrestled with in your permaculture journey, and had to learn how to actually apply in real life the sort of design theory, or indeed that you've discarded? We talked about climbers not really working in cool temperate gardens. Is there any other design idea that has been more challenging in
Um,
permaculture? Dogma.
I think that I try not to get too bogged down in rules. I've always been a bit of a rule breaker.
Yeah.
So I know people have funny ideas sometimes about permaculture. Like I've had people who say you can't use straight lines in a permaculture garden. You know, there's all sorts of funny rules that people put in place that make no sense to me.
Mm,
So I think I definitely go with what works for me. And so long as it fits in with the ethics,
mm,
that's good enough for me. And even things like, I like this idea of integrate, not segregate.
mm,
But sometimes actually segregate is way better, and actually sometimes it was quite, whilst I tried to integrate the kids into the garden, sometimes it was just wonderful if my husband just took them out for the day and I could get some gardening done and it just worked better for everybody,
yeah.
So I think that whilst there are instances where integrating is wonderful, sometimes segregating is wonderful too. And
Yeah.
that's why I have in my own garden, I have a forest garden in one part of the garden. And at the bottom of the garden is going to be soon to be a perennial salad garden. So that's more focusing on the kind of herbaceous layer of things. In between, I have some annual beds because actually a lot of annual vegetables, they don't grow well with competition from other plants. So I have to segregate them because otherwise they just won't really grow. And it's good to have some of the annual vegetables because they're high yielding, and so I feel like yeah, it's what feels like it works with you. I remember someone telling me that you couldn't have cats in a permaculture system because somebody had mentioned, I can't remember if it was David Holgram or someone had said, how bad cats were for permaculture. So this person was adamant that if you owned a cat, you didn't have a permaculture garden. I mean, I personally don't own a cat because I don't like the fact that they eat birds. So we don't have a cat. But I thought it was funny to think that just owning a cat immediately excluded you from permaculture living. So yeah, I think don't be afraid to break rules if that's what you need to get to grow successfully.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. I have a highly segregated annual vegetable raised bed system where I grow loads of annual veg, like broad beans and runner beans and French beans and
Mm,
onions, and then I have more perennial systems and fruit trees. So but they can't all get mixed up together.
yeah, I mean,
Annuals are greedy things and they want sunlight and nutrition.
yes, and there are some things that work quite well. Like I've mixed in pumpkins into a perennial system because I've
Yeah.
grown them upwards, so they're
Mm.
kind of getting away from the competition.
Mm.
I've grown courgettes and beans and things like that, but you kind of have to clear a little space really,
Yes.
so that
Yeah.
they're not having that competition
Well,
from
it's
other
your
things.
forest
And
clearing, isn't it?
yes, and
It's
give
your
them a little
red.
boost.
Yeah.
I don't have to light any fires to clear space in my forest, luckily.
No.
But every now and again, if something dies, I just think, well, that's a great opportunity. I'll just put in an annual there for a year while I think about what I want to replace it with.
So in your books, you do emphasize low cost gardening because gardening can be incredibly expensive, particularly for
Mm.
people who are just starting, and that can often be hugely off-putting. What are your best recommends for people who are working within very tight budgets? That would,
I think for me, I mean, I am a Yorkshire woman, so of course I like to not spend money ever if possible. But I think things like plant swaps are fantastic,
yeah.
seed swaps to get plants. I know a lot of perennial vegetables are expensive. Fruit
Mm,
trees can be expensive. So I
mm,
think if you can find someone who's already growing something, quite often they'll be more than happy to give you a few divisions, a few offsets, a few bulbils.
mm,
Even if you're bartering and saying, "Oh, well, I've made some jam, could I
mm.
swap it for some Babington leek bulbils?" Or, I've got some honey from my bees, could I
Yeah,
maybe swap that for a cutting of Tawnterdine kale?
yeah,
So I think definitely bartering, swapping, is a really great way. I think not to feel like you need to buy in loads of materials. I always think when people are growing food, even if it's perennial, they immediately think they need to build edged raised beds and things like that. Whereas actually, most of the raised beds that I've ever grown in don't have edges.
mm,
Actually, slugs like to hide in there.
mm,
So, where
mm,
possible, I haven't done that. I've got them at the moment in a few beds because they're temporary and I keep moving them around. So,
mm.
um, and just to find, to be resourceful. So we're lucky that one of our clients that we garden for, because they've got quite a big field and a lot of trees, we make way more compost there than they can possibly use. So they're happy for us to bring leaves and cut grass back here to use as mulch, and
Mm.
so we don't have to buy in any additional compost or mulch or fertilizer. But just if maybe your neighbour wouldn't mind or might be glad if you offer to cut their lawn, so long as you get to keep their lawn clippings or something like that. I think just being resourceful as much as you can, and not
Yeah,
being afraid to ask
yeah,
if you can sort of do an exchange of um yeah, of cuttings or cut grass or that kind of thing.
yeah, great idea. So just a couple of real quickies now. Um, Give me one plant that everyone should grow but rarely do.
Oh gosh, I always find these questions really difficult. I think everlasting onions, they are one of my favorite. They're so easy to grow. You just harvest a bunch of them, plant a couple back in the ground, and then they regrow again, and then you can harvest some more, and they're really tasty.
Lovely, lovely. And what question, Pippa, do you wish people would ask you more often when you're doing interviews?
Um, oh, that's a really tough one. Yeah, I think what would be good actually is if people said, what do you get, what's your biggest failure that you have every year? Because I think
Oh,
sometimes it's all right for me to sit here and say, oh yes, I do this wonderfully, with my many years of experience, but quite often, the reality of my life at home is, oh, I was so busy writing a book that I forgot to put any stakes in the ground and my peas all just fell over and got eaten by slugs. And I think sometimes when people know that you, as a professional, there's quite a lot that you don't do right, it makes them feel a bit more, yeah, like it's okay for them to get it wrong and not beat themselves up.
and I think that's what's so encouraging about what you do and your YouTubes and what you're writing about is that you're always encouraging people to have a go and not feel that they're going to fail if they make mistakes because we all make mistakes.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I like to think of it. I was having this chat with my husband actually the other day, and I said I like to think of gardening as a bit like a kind of experiment or an adventure, because when you're having an adventure, you kind of expect things to go a bit wrong, and that's kind of the fun bit, isn't it? If you just did it all and it all went perfectly, where's the excitement? So by reframing gardening as a kind of experiment, it's almost like you're ready for things to go a bit wrong, but
Yeah,
for you to learn from that and then
yeah.
get it a little bit better next time.
Exactly, exactly. Well, thanks so much for talking to me today. Um, we will obviously put the links to particularly this marvelous book, which is so beautiful and filled with, if you're wondering what plants to plant, this garden design book is just full of gorgeous pictures and really exciting ideas and plants for shade and palette planters, so many different, we've mentioned some aspects of it, but it's just so rich. And you took all the photographs yourself, didn't you?
Yeah.
And you drew the diagrams too. So it's all from you. It's not, we haven't gone off and looked for pictures from stock libraries. It's all from,
No, I wanted it to look like my scrapbook that I use on a
yeah,
daily basis when I'm
yeah.
designing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's for me that brings it so to life and makes it so authentic.